All right, let's talk for a moment about digestive motility. So motility was the use of those patterns of movement in the smooth muscle of the digestive tract meant to help us control the movement of materials. So in most of the digestive tract, what you've got, if you've got a tube of digestive tract here, you'll have a combination of some level of longitudinal muscle. So a muscle where it's kind of oriented around that way, so it would make the tube shorter when it contracts, combined with some amount of circular muscle. So circular muscle being when it contracts, it makes the tube narrower, squeezing in. And these will be connected in single units, so you'll have like a ring of circular muscle that can contract at that spot, or one particular area has its longitudinal muscle, so that whole area gets shorter. And some areas will also have oblique muscle that kind of goes around it in more of a spiral way that produces different kinds of contraction. But pretty much all of them have circular and longitudinal muscle. Now, the contraction of those muscles is going to be coordinated by the enteric nervous system. Remember, that is comprised of those two plexuses, the submucosal and myenteric plexus. Most of the big patterns of contraction are going to be controlled by the myenteric plexus, which is actually between these layers of smooth muscle. The submucosal plexus is deeper in, closer to the inner layer, and actually is mostly involved in causing small movements of the inner surface of the digestive tract. But with this enteric nervous system controlling the overall movement patterns, by coordinating how the controllers, the pacemakers for each single unit work, we can have this contract in different patterns. And there's kind of three patterns I want to mention. The first is peristalsis, which we've mentioned a little bit before. So in peristalsis, we would have contractions mostly in the circular muscle around this. And what we would do is contract these areas in sequence. So if you imagine that this is part of our gastrointestinal tube, a peristaltic contraction would involve contracting area 1, then 2, then 3, 4, 5, 6 in a wave going down. And what that would do is have a squeezing area which travels down and effectively pushes the material in the tube down the tube in that direction. So by having these contract in that sequential order, you can make a wave of contraction that forces materials to move down the tube. You see peristalsis in the esophagus, where it's involved in contracting in a wave that moves downward to move food down the esophagus. You see it in the stomach, where it's involved in squishing food along, and then when the stomach empties, a peristaltic contraction can push a little bit of food into the duodenum, which, as we mentioned, then will tell the stomach to slow down and process that first, but still, it's used there. You also do see this in the intestines, especially the small intestine. Although it is mostly over relatively short, it's not like it goes down the whole intestine to smooth everything along, although we will talk about something that's kind of similar in a bit, but regular peristalsis is only over very short distances, so it would be used to take a little bit of food and move it to the next little bit of intestine, where another kind of contraction is going to be involved in mixing and churning it. So that's the first pattern. If you imagine we had all of these pacemaker cells, all we need to do is have the nervous system trigger them in the right order, and you get a peristaltic contraction. So the second pattern that we're going to mention is segmental contractions. This is mostly seen in the small intestine. So in a segmental contraction, that's going to involve one particular area on the small intestine. And what you're going to get is an alternating contraction, where you get 1, then 2, then 1, then 2, then 1, then 2. What that's going to do is squish the food over here and then squish it back and back and back and kind of get this churning, mixing motion where really you're just sloshing the partially digested food around. That accomplishes several things. Number one, it mixes the food mixture so that the enzymes that you've added to it get thoroughly mixed with the food, and so all the little bits of food get attacked by the enzymes and broken down. Number two, it makes sure that the digested materials get sloshed around so that they come into contact with the intestinal walls so they can be absorbed. This works a little, if you have a washing machine or have ever watched one work, you know that there comes a point in the cycle where the agitator in the washing machine, if you've got one of those vertical ones, it kind of goes back and forth. And if you've got a top-down one, it swishes back and forth like this. That's kind of doing the same thing. You're sloshing and mixing the material to make sure that in the washing machine, the detergent and water get all through the clothes, and here, so that the enzymes get all through the food. In any case, this can also involve some amount of longitudinal contraction. So you can get these areas in an alternating fashion and longitudinal contractions helping to slosh things around. So that's segmental contractions, mostly done in the intestine. And you combine this with peristalsis to have, say you'll have an area bit of food, squeeze it into the next section with peristalsis, then do some segmental contractions and mix it and slosh it and churn it, and then do a little peristalsis to the next area and then segmental and squish it and slosh it. And just bit by bit, you make sure that it moves along and keeps getting mixed. So by the time you get down toward the end of the intestine, it's been thoroughly digested and everything has been absorbed. Now, the third pattern is the migrating motor complex. This is kind of an interesting one. This is a pattern, it's based on peristalsis, but it happens when the intestines are empty. So this doesn't really start happening until at least an hour and a half after the last time you ate something. So this can start when your stomach is empty, when it's completely emptied, everything has moved on, and now we're kind of wanting to get things moving along. So the migrating motor complex starts in the stomach usually, or maybe the duodenum. So it starts there, and it's a slow sort of wave of contraction, sort of like a peristalsis, that travels from the stomach or duodenum, wherever it begins, all the way through the small intestine, up to the large intestine, although it does not go into there. So this travels through the whole small intestine. What this seems to be for is sweeping non-digested material or things that are getting left behind, just sweeping them down the tube, clearing stuff out, moving it all down toward the large intestine. So think of it as cleaning house, that we move everything down into there. And the stuff that's in the large intestine, this helps to move it along. So another thing this is useful for is we normally do not have a lot of bacteria growing in the small intestine. Those are supposed to grow in the large intestine. So as you get some bacteria starting to grow in the later parts of the small intestine, the migrating motor complex helps to shove them down, move those bacteria on into the large intestine. And any bacteria from the large intestine that are starting to move back up into the small, this helps to move them down the way. There are clinical conditions where people have dysfunction in this, where they don't have normal migrating motor complexes. And in those people, you often get overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine, which is a recognized condition. You're not supposed to get a lot of bacteria there. In any case, this does not go on into the large intestine. So the large intestine actually does not usually undergo much peristalsis. Instead of that same kind of peristalsis in the large intestine, what we get is periodic, larger scale contractions of the small intestine that just sort of move everything toward the end. Those can also be triggered by taking in new food, which is why sometimes immediately after eating, you find yourself needing to defecate, because what you've done is trigger one of those larger scale movements, which has moved a bunch of stuff into the rectum, and now it's time to remove it. So that covers the basic 3 motility patterns, which can be coordinated just by having different programs in the pacemaker cells, having the enteric nervous system handle all this differently. So that finishes our first lecture on the digestive system. In lecture 2, we're going to go and look at things in more detail at each of the stages. We'll talk about different phases of digestion and some of the different enzymes used and how these things get absorbed. So, see you then.